Good morning and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Our church is founded on the principles of scientific naturalism and secular ethics. Truth claims are attempted here, and we stand ready to revise our thinking in light of new information. We attempt to be excellent to all conscious beings, and we believe in good, because good works in non-mysterious ways. If that sounds good to you, then you are probably in the right place. So the members ourselves give the talks, and then after we give the talks, we'll get into a circle and have some discussion time. If you would like to donate any money for the renting of this room, then you could do that at seattleatheist.church. There's a link there. The third Saturday of the month, we have a secular social at Brower's at 3 p.m., and everyone is invited to that. So without further ado, Tyrell, please come on up.
Hey everyone, I'm going to be talking about the science of well-being today. So this is a cool thing to talk about now because psychology has sort of like a lot of new insights on the types of things that contribute to human well-being. And recently, there have been a lot of successes in applying these insights to changing people's behaviors in real time. On top of that, anxiety disorders are the most common type of mental illness in the US right now, affecting about 40 million US adults a year, and depression's not too far behind. So I'm going to share a little bit about what science has to say about why this might be happening and what are some of the things that we can do about it. So the first thing to know about well-being is that our mind's strongest intuitions are often completely wrong, and especially about things that we think are going to make us happy. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on 4 things that people generally think is going to make them happy that don't always or don't usually as much as we think. So the first thing people think is going to make us happy is a good job. So a lot of people think once you find a good job, you're going to be set, things are going to be great, and we can look to science to see if this is actually true. So I'm going to share a study done by the psychologist Dan Gilbert. And what he did is he had college students interview for a job that most college students would think is cool and be really hyped on getting, and he had them rate their happiness before and after this process and predicted what it would be like if they were to be turned down. So everyone predicted how happy or upset they would be if they didn't get the job beforehand, and nobody got the job because it was an experiment, and that's the way the study was done. And what they found was that people predicted that they would have a drop of about 2.1 points on average on the 10-point scale in their happiness. What actually happened is their happiness only dropped by 0.68 on average. So people were a little bit upset, but not as much as they thought, and like way less than anything sort of like significant towards their well-being. So that's jobs. Another thing that we sort of pursue related to jobs is money. We want a lot of money. And the psychologist Sonia Lyubomirsky reported some data on this, and she looked at how much people think the money that they need is to be happy. How much people think they need to make in terms of to make them happy. And what she found was that the amount that we want, the amount that we think is going to make us happy is actually higher based on our actual income. So the more money you actually make, the more you think you need. And sort of along this vein, the most recent World Values Survey, which is this huge data collection effort, it looks at changing values in tons of different countries. It records a lot of different data on a lot of people. Found on average only a 0.13 correlation between income and life satisfaction. And even that 0.13 is actually a result of poorer nations having a stronger correlation. So it seems that once your basic needs are met, there's actually a very, very small correlation between income and life satisfaction. And it has a very negligible effect on well-being. And a very recent, very famous science paper that sort of looked into this same idea was done by Danny Kahneman and Angus Deaton, two Nobel Prize winning psychologists and economists, who polled 450,000 Americans, and they wanted to look at how income predicts positive affect, so how it predicts people feeling stress-free or feeling not blue. And what they found was that at low income levels, having income increase actually increases your happiness a little bit, but it starts to level off, and after about $75,000 a year, it actually doesn't have any effect at all. So Americans, after making $75,000 a year, don't see any increase in their happiness with additional income. So another thing that we want that is kind of related to money is we want awesome stuff. We want like cool clothes, we want like a new car, and we want like the newest phones and gadgets and whatnot. Think that's gonna make us happy, but is this actually true? Psychologist Carol Nickerson looked at this with her colleagues, and what she did is she surveyed 12,000 college freshmen and asked them a bunch of questions, and some of those questions asked about their ideas about materialism, sort of like testing their materialistic attitudes. She followed up with these same people 20 years later, and what the study showed was that the people who reported having more materialistic attitudes actually had lower life satisfaction 20 years later than the other people. And not only that, but people with more materialistic attitudes actually had a higher probability of being diagnosed with a DSM mental disorder. So, do things make us happy? It doesn't really look like it, judging by the data. And then another thing that we pursue in the name of happiness is true love. So, Disney has taught us all since we were kids that true love is what you need, and once you find it, you'll be happily ever after, and all that good stuff. But is it actually true? Well, we can look to science and see what that has to say about it. And that's what Richard Lucas and his colleagues did when they surveyed 25,000 people and followed them for 15 years. Now, over the course of 15 years, things happen, people's lives change. Some of the people in the study got married, and he was able to look at the dates and times they got married and look at how that related to their levels of happiness, and what did they find? So it seems like people's happiness increased during sort of like honeymoon period. So during like 1 to 2 years around the marriage, people saw an increase in positive emotions. But after that, they went back to their baseline. So it seems like love doesn't have the magical effect on happiness that some people think it does. Now, all of these things that I just mentioned are examples of what the psychologists Tim Wilson and Dan Gilbert call miswanting, sort of being mistaken about what we want and how much we think those things are going to affect our happiness. And that's just one of the sort of annoying features of our mind that actually work against us in terms of our pursuit of well-being. If you want to think about this as like a metaphor, our brains are kind of like a software, and these are kind of like bugs in the software. So it's kind of like the things that our brains do that mess us up. I'm going to go over a few more of those things now. So another thing that our brains do that's sort of antithetical to our happiness is our minds don't think in terms of absolutes. They actually are built to think in terms of reference points. And these are often salient but kind of irrelevant sort of standards that we compare info to. And that leads to a lot of social comparison. So the way that people judge their own salary or status or possessions relative to other people around them. And this has a pretty nasty effect on our happiness. One really interesting study that looked into this was done by Peter Kuhn and his colleagues, and he looked at lottery winners of this specific lottery that not only did you win a lot of money with the lottery, but you also win a new car. So these people get this brand new car, they take it home, and Kuhn and them looked at sort of the people in the neighborhoods and looked at their spending habits and found that if you live in the house next to the person who won this lottery, you're almost twice as likely to buy a new car in the next year than other people in the neighborhood. So even just being around this person who won the lottery makes you more likely to buy a new car, and then the next person in the next house was a little bit more likely than other people in the neighborhood, etc. So that's sort of an example of how we compare and how we sort of try and judge ourselves based on others. Another study that looked at this was done by the researcher Thomas O'Gwyn, and he actually predicted the results of his study, where he found that people who watch more TV have a higher estimate of others' wealth than compared to their own, and as a result are less satisfied with their own income. And the economist Juliet Schroer actually did a follow-up study on this, where she was able to calculate that for each extra hour of TV you watch a week, you spend an extra $4 a week. So really quantifying this sort of like idea of people trying to keep up with the Joneses and trying to compare themselves to others. Now, what's interesting is right now, a lot of us are exposed to a particular set of reference points that people weren't exposed to even just a few decades ago. And I'm talking, of course, about social media. So we use Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat, and we have all these reference points available all the time that people didn't have to deal with a few years ago. So researchers wanted to look into this, and that's exactly what Erin Vogel and her colleagues did. And she found a high negative correlation between Facebook use and self-esteem. Now, correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. Some of my scientifically minded friends might think. So what they did is she did another follow-up study where she did an experimental intervention where she actually exposed people to fake Facebook feeds. And what she did is she had participants rate their self-esteem before and after, but she split these participants into two groups. So one group she called the upward comparison group, and they were exposed to a fake Facebook feed that had people doing like awesome stuff. So people going on vacations and hanging out with friends and doing cool sports and basically people with exciting lives. And then the other group was exposed to sort of Facebook feed with less exciting people, I guess, not doing anything interesting, kind of like a loserish Facebook feed. And she was looking at how these different feeds affected people. Now, what's interesting is the people who were in the upward comparison group, they did actually have a lower self-rating after the experiment, after watching all these cool people on Facebook. But the people who were doing the downward comparison, they actually didn't see any increase in their self-rating. So it seems that we make upward comparisons and that affects our feelings of ourselves, but our exposure to downward comparisons doesn't actually have that same impact. It doesn't give us that same boost. Another thing that our brains do that kind of messes us up is our brains are just kind of built to get used to stuff. So some of you are already familiar with the process of hedonic adaptation, and this is the process by which we get accustomed to whatever things in our life, whatever positive or negative stimulus in our lives, and the emotional effects of those things are just weakened over time. And I'll just highlight one study that looked into this, done by Rafael Ditella, and what he did is he tested 7,000 people and followed them for 20 years. As people's salaries went up, which a lot of them did, over those 20 years, people's happiness levels didn't increase. And this kind of study has been done over and over again to show that we just sort of hedonically adapt to things in that way. Now the problem is we don't realize that our brains are built to get used to stuff. And that means that we're sort of unaware of this kind of psychological immune system we have. We're unaware of how strong and resilient our brains are, how much we can endure as a result. Because remember, we do adapt to negative events as well. This leads to what psychologists call an impact bias. So sort of the tendency to overestimate the emotional impact of future events. And we overestimate the impact of these things both in terms of duration and in terms of intensity. And the impact bias is actually worse for negative events. So one study that looked at this and highlighted it was Linda Levine. She had students predict how they were going to feel after getting grades, and the students generally predicted that if their grades were higher than they expected, their happiness would be at like an 8.2 on a 10-point scale, and if their grades were lower than expected, they would be at like a 4.4. So they'd be really upset if their grades were lower than they expected. And then what did the results show actually after they got their grades? Their happiness level, if they were higher, was just a 6.5, and if they were lower, it was a 6.3. So really not that big an effect. Studies like this have been done on people who have been denied tenure, people going through breakups, people even receiving HIV results, and they all show sort of similar patterns. Our brains are just kind of bad at these things. So those are some biases that our brains have, but just knowing about the existence of these biases actually doesn't make us immune to them. That itself is a fallacy. So kind of in the same way that you can't teach your eyes not to see optical illusions, right? Even if you know you're reading like a book of optical illusions, you can't just be immune to these biases just because you know about them. It's not enough to actually change your behavior. So I'm going to share some sort of intentional strategies that you can use to overcome these biases. So one thing that you can do is just don't buy stuff in the first place. It's actually better if you invest your money in experiences. So things like vacations or concerts or going to movies or even just going out to eat. These are all better purchases in terms of ensuring our well-being because we don't have time to hedonically adapt to them. So they make us happier than physical stuff. One study by Chellen and Howell looked at this, and people predicted how they were going to feel about future purchases. And they sort of like coded for cost in terms of comparing experiential and material purchases, because some people were making some of each. And people generally predicted that the material purchases were going to make them happier than the experiential purchases. Now, what did the data actually show? Well, even 2 to 4 weeks after consumption of the purchase, people actually experienced and reported being more satisfied with the experiential purchases than the material purchases. And that's sort of common across the board with these kinds of studies. Drink some water. So another thing that we can do to sort of offset the biases that we have is we can try and consciously do this practice of savoring, sort of stepping outside of an experience that's happening right now and trying to review and appreciate it consciously. So,
do you want to pause maybe for a
sure,
just
yeah.
a second?
Are we supposed to savor this?
Savor this moment. Delicious water. All right. So another thing that we can do to overcome our biases is try and use this process of savoring. So it's kind of the act of intentionally stepping outside of an experience to review and appreciate it consciously. So things that you can do is talk to someone else about how much you're enjoying something or how good you feel. Just sharing experiences with other people in general is a good thing to do, or just trying to kind of be absorbed and be present and in the moment. You can even savor for things that have happened in the past too. An interesting study done by Sonia Lubomirsky. She had people replay happy memories for 8 minutes a day, 3 days a week, for a set amount of time. And what she found is that people who did this actually had an increase in positive emotions, and actually sustained that increase in positive emotions for 4 weeks beyond the study, which is kind of crazy. And then another tactic that we can use to sort of offset our cognitive biases is this idea of negative visualization. So kind of trying to think about how things could be worse. And one study that looked at this and highlighted this, they had couples write for 15 minutes about how they might never have met their partner. And then a control group of couples wrote for 15 minutes about how they met their partner. And what did they find? The group that wrote about how they might never have met their partner saw an increase in positive emotions, and it was actually a significant difference. It was a whole 1 point on a 7-point scale compared to the control. So that's something that you can do. Psychologists also talk about concretely re-experiencing things, so try and remind yourself what things were like before X. So what were things like before you got that new job, or before you started that new friendship, or before you moved into that new home, and try and appreciate things as a result of just thinking about them in that light. Or just concretely observe, so trying to observe from a worse reference point, identify your reference point, and observe your situation from a worse one. So if you're watching this talk online, you can recognize the fact that half the world's population still doesn't have internet access, and you can take the chance to observe and appreciate the fact that you do as a result. And that's kind of related to my last little tactic, which is just kind of gratitude, just intentionally showing appreciation for the things that you have. And one cool study that looked at this was done by Robert Emmons and Michael McCullough. And what they did is they split participants into 3 groups. One group wrote down 5 things that they were grateful for at the end of the week. Another group wrote 5 hassles, 5 things that bothered them throughout the week. And then the control group just wrote 5 things, 5 events. It could be positive or negative. What did they find? The group writing sort of like a gratitude journal saw an increase in their subjective well-being. And Marty Seligman, another psychologist, took this a step further and had people do gratitude visits, where they actually wrote a letter of gratitude to someone in their life who they appreciated and actually gave that letter to that person. And what's cool is not only did they feel the same boost in subjective well-being, they actually had that increase sustained for 3 months after doing the gratitude visit, which is kind of insane. So these are all like cool tactics, but our minds just don't want to do this in general. Your minds aren't going to want to, negative visualize or do any of that stuff really. So this has to be intentional. You have to make a conscious effort if you want to see the benefits from these strategies. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is there's some stuff that we actually should be wanting, things that will make us happy, that we don't necessarily prioritize the same way we prioritize the things that I began the talk with. So the first thing that I'll mention is just social connection. It seems that just being with people actually has a positive effect on our emotions and our well-being. So Seligman again did a study on this where he looked at people's self-reporting data, and people who self-reported being happy generally self-reported also having closer friendships, stronger family ties, and that sort of stuff. And then another study that sort of was more experimental was done by Nick Epley and Juliana Schroeder. And what they did is they went up to random people at a train station. They were like, hey, do you want to be in a study? They said yes. They were like, okay, cool. They had them do some surveys, and then they put them in one of 3 groups. So they were either in the connection group, and they were like, okay, when you get on the train, just go talk to someone, try and make a connection with someone. Or they were in the solitude group, where they just were supposed to get on the train and not talk to anyone, just, whatever, listen to music or be by yourself. And then the control group, where it's just like, okay, just go on the train and then do whatever you normally do. And what did they find? It turns out that people who talked to people on the train saw an increase in positive emotions, even though before the study, participants actually predicted the opposite would be the outcome. Another study that found similar results was done by Erica Boothby and her colleagues, and what they did is they had subjects come in for a study and rate how much they enjoyed experiences. They had them eating chocolate or viewing art in a museum. And some participants were in a group where they just did these things alone, and then others were in a group where they did this with a confederate, so another fake participant, and they were even advised not to talk to the other participant, really. So they did these things just with another person present while they did them. And what happened? The people who had the shared experience rated their experience better, higher. They were more satisfied with the chocolate or the art than the people who did them alone. So it seems like even just the mere presence of other people is enough to change the way that we experience things and increase our well-being. Another thing that we should be seeking out that we don't necessarily is sort of opportunities to just act more kindly to each other. And I know this sounds super cheesy, but I have some empirical evidence to share. So one study was done by Sonia Lubomirsky again, and she had people doing random acts of kindness. It turns out that people who did more random acts of kindness compared to other groups that did less or did none had a greater increase in positive emotions. And then another study that was done by Liz Dunn and Mike Norton looked at giving money. So they actually just went up to random people on the street, were like, hey, do you want to be on a study? They said yes. They took some tests, and then they gave them some cash. And they were just like, here's $5 or here's $20. The only rule is you have to either spend it on yourself or spend it on someone else. And then you just have to agree that we can call you later and ask you some questions. So they did that. People were like, hell yeah, I just got some free cash and spent it. And what happened was people who spent the money on other people saw a greater increase in their well-being than people who spent the money on themselves. And it turns out the amount spent doesn't matter either. So even if they spent $5 or if they spent $20 or $10, they still had the same boost. And importantly, the participants before this study predicted the opposite results would be the case. So it seems this is another example of us sort of like miswanting or being unaware of the things that actually make us happy. Now, this study was repeated. They did the original study in British Columbia. So they did another follow-up study in Uganda in a community that was less affluent, where they could give them $20 and it would be a bigger deal. It would have a bigger impact to see what the differences would be, and the results were almost the same. So it seems that the effects of this sort of giving are continuous across cultures and across income levels. So one final thing that I want to talk about is mind wandering. So sort of like a shift in thoughts away from present events or the present task to sort of like more self-generated feelings and thoughts, and how that has a negative impact. So Matthew Killingsworth and Dan Gilbert actually looked at this. They did an experience sampling survey where they looked at 2,000 people and just sort of gave them all apps on their phone. So at random times they would be prompted to just answer a few questions about what they were thinking about and how they were feeling and that sort of stuff. And what they found is that mind wandering has a negative impact on emotions. So at least when people's minds are wandering, they generally rated themselves as less happy than otherwise. And this is kind of a big deal because they also, in the same study, determined that people's minds wander a lot, about 46% of the time, it seems, according to this data. So what can we do about that? And there's a few different things. There's a few different practices of meditation specifically, where people focus on turning your thoughts away from sort of like distracting things and towards one single point of reference. And sometimes it's the breath, maybe it's body sensations. You might meditate on like a specific idea like compassion, but that's sort of like the types of things that you do with meditation. Now, realize that I'm in a group of skeptics talking about meditation right now, so I'm going to go ahead and just dive into a little bit of neuroscience really fast. So obviously, different parts of the brain are active during different tasks. Researchers have been looking at this for a long time. And one thing that researchers have consistently found is while they're doing this sort of like functional neuroimaging tests on participants, whenever they're done with the task, a very specific set of neuroregions sort of kicks in, and it kicks in very quickly. It can come on within a fraction of a second after the task that they're studying. These specific areas in the brain light up. And this is what they've deemed the default network. So it's this network of interacting brain regions that is sort of just like on in the background when you're not doing something actively. And it's the same parts of the brain that activate when people are prompted to think about the past, or when participants are prompted to think about the future, or basically just thinking about things that are outside the here and now. The same areas of the brain light up. So back to meditation, one study done by Judson Brewer tested expert meditators compared to control. These meditators are people who have like 10,000 hours of practice recorded. And what she found is that these meditators actually had less activity in this sort of default mode network of their brain. And what's crazy is they had less activity, not just when they were meditating, but even while they weren't meditating. These parts of the brain were less active than in the average person. So it seems that there is a difference here. But what does that mean for well-being? Well, Barbara Fredrickson, this psychologist, did a survey on this where she plotted emotions across an 8-week meditation intervention and found that people have a positive emotion boost from meditation specifically. And another crazy sort of like experiment that was done on this was done at Harvard, where researchers were measuring the size of gray matter in the brain in meditators, and during an 8-week meditation intervention where they did a half hour of meditation a day, they found that people actually increased the amount of gray matter in specific areas of the cerebellum and specific areas of the cortex. So meditation is actually having a physical, tangible effect on the brain and how it works. And it seems like that effect also has positive effects on our well-being. So those are some of the things that we should be wanting. And that's kind of like a general broad overview of the science of well-being, what sort of information is out there right now, what psychology has figured out. So sort of in summary, there are some things that we think that we should want and think are going to make us happy, but science is telling us they don't actually have as big an impact as we thought. There are also some biases, some processes that our brain does that mess us up and are antithetical to our happiness. There are some strategies that we can use to overcome those, but they have to be effortful and intentional. And then there are also some things that we should want, should prioritize, but don't always, that science is telling us can increase our well-being. So I hope you all use some of these things. Think about trying to implement some of these ideas into your daily lives. And thanks everyone for listening.